Your own arguments for the existence of God are part of that group of a priori arguments for God. However, they have the originality of trying to show that the very same sort of thinking that we use in science when we believe, for instance, that there are atoms or quarks, it's by that very same standard of reasoning that we have good arguments for the existence of God. So perhaps you could expand a little, not only on your own argument, but why is that so very so close to our common scientific thinking?
Yes. Well, I think the way that science works, and not just science, but any empirical inquiry, the sort of inquiry that historians do, arguing from diaries and physical remains into once upon a time the Romans lived here, or the way that detectives argue from various clues to so-and-so did the murder. And that's the same way as scientists argue from all sorts of data in their labs or through their telescopes to a general theory as to how the world works. And I think the pattern of this argument is as follows. Scientists observe their data, historians observe their data, and then historian or scientist puts forward a theory, a hypothesis. Jones did the murder, or all chemical substances are made of atoms of certain kinds, or once upon a time the Romans lived here. And this hypothesis is judged probable insofar as 4 criteria are satisfied. First, the hypothesis must be such as to, if it's true, you would expect to find the data. That is, if it's true, it makes it probable that you would find the data. If it's false, you wouldn't expect to find the data. It's not probable you'd find the data. And then it must be a simple hypothesis, because it's always possible to construct an infinite number of hypotheses, quite different from each other, which are such that if they're true, you would expect to find the data. If they're false, you wouldn't expect to find the data. I'll elaborate on that perhaps in a moment. And then fourth condition is that if it's a hypothesis dealing with a narrow field, e.g. who did the murder, as opposed to what are the most general laws of nature, then your hypothesis has to fit in with your other knowledge about the world. Now let's illustrate that with a simple detective example. Suppose there's been a murder, and the detectives are investigating who did the murder. They've got certain clues. There was a corpse on the floor, and a lot of blood in the room. And subsequently it's found that Jones had a grudge against the person who was killed, that there was a lot of blood on Jones's clothes after the murder took place, and that Jones was seen climbing into the room where the murder was reported as having been seen, climbing into the room where the murder took place. So detectives naturally suggest Jones did the murder. Now, if Jones did the murder, you would expect to find these things, not necessarily, but it's quite likely that you would find these things. You would find that he was around at the time, that if he did kill the person concerned, you would expect there to be blood on his clothes, and of course you would expect him to have a motive for killing the person. On the other hand, if Jones didn't do the murder, then there's no particular reason why he would be climbing into the window at that time, or that there would be blood on his clothes, and so on. But on the other hand, it's always possible for anyone to invent innumerable different hypotheses, which are such as, if they're true, you would find the data, and if they're false, you wouldn't find the data. For example, the defense lawyer defending Jones might suggest the reason my client didn't really climb into the room where the murder took place. It's just that he looks rather like someone whom we haven't actually found, his identical twin, who doesn't like the person who had been killed. And the identical twin was the person who was climbing into the room. and the identical twin didn't actually do the murder. Even so, the murder was done by somebody quite different called Robinson, who happened to be in the room at the time. And why blood is on my client's clothes is because he fell downstairs and cut his leg badly, and it has cured up. It has got better rather quickly, so that you can't see the scar anymore. And yes, he did have a grudge against the person killed, but so what? Now, if all that I've said is true, then it is the case that you would expect to find the data, and you wouldn't otherwise expect the data, because if it's true there is an identical twin who was climbing into the room, well, people would report somebody like James was climbing into the room. And if it's true that my client fell downstairs, then you would expect to find blood, and sure, scars do heal fairly quickly sometimes. So you get, you could have innumerable different hypotheses which are such that if they're true, you would find the data, and if they're false, you wouldn't. But the reason why the second hypothesis put forward by the accused's lawyer is clearly ruled out as impossible is because it's very complicated. You are postulating three different people at work about whom you have no further evidence at all. Insofar as it's concerned with a narrow field, as it is in this case, the hypothesis has to fit in with other things we know. For example, if we know that Jones is a very peace-loving person who would never get angry with anybody, then we need to take this into account too as reason against the hypothesis that he did the murder. Or if he has previously been accused of a murder, or previously even been found guilty of a murder, that would make him quite likely that he had committed this murder. So that's the general way it works. Now, the same applies to science, and science often postulates unobservable entities in order to explain the observable entities. Indeed, it's been characteristic of science since 1800 that it postulates